Hi, I'm your friend Claude,
And it's cousin Adam.
and this is the fifth episode of WAMCast. We have made it to number five. We have an assortment of topics for such an occasion to thrill your ears with this time, including Hall of Fame selection processes. We have lots and lots of Star Wars, all kinds of pop culture tidbits for you. Cousin Adam, what do you think we should tackle first?
Well, I think there is a scandal of sorts going on right now. If people haven't heard, the AFC football title game last week, played by the Patriots and the Colts, Patriots won that game decidedly. There was a little bit of controversy, though. Apparently, some of the game balls were not inflated to their proper specs per the NFL league rules. So, what have you heard about this topic?
Just that there's a lot of back and forth. Did they cheat? Didn't they cheat? Did it affect the outcome of the game or not? Apparently, Bill Belichick has got quite the reputation as a cheater, or at least as some sort of anal perfectionist. I don't really, honestly, I'm not a football guy in any way. I sort of hear these things second, third, or however, whatever the number hand is by the time it gets to me. Yeah, a lot of people seem to be bickering and confused, and it would be awesome just as a non-fan to see something like this lead to like a do-over. I don't know if that's ever happened in NFL history or not, but it'd be kind of fun to see such a chaotic thing have to occur.
Yeah, I look at it. There, you know, it is basically a rule of some sort was broken, whether it was intentional or not. The way I look at it is that the first thing that appalled me was I was at work today and I went up to the break room and they usually show like CNN or something
Oh,
on
right.
on the TV up there, and the big headline at the time was this cheating thing. What is CNN? I mean they're a news station. This isn't really like breaking news. I mean, I know that it's the Super Bowl. It's the most popular game, or it's like it's the biggest game of like arguably the most popular sport in our country coming up, and one of the teams that's going to be represented in this, did something wrong. However, I kind of feel like get your sports news from like ESPN or something. They're the ones that like know what they're doing.
Right.
That they're sports. Like they don't talk about other crap. Where CNN should be has its attention somewhere else. But anyway, my take on it
Absolutely.
is it's really not that big of a deal when it comes to the outcome of the game. The way I look at it is even if there's rule broken, okay, let's say the balls were inflated to their proper specs, okay, that would not have affected the fact that the Patriots basically cleaned house with the Colts. I mean, they dismantled that team and took them apart. That's kind of out of the question. Like even if like the balls were deflated a couple of pounds, not really going to do anything. It is a fact that if your ball is deflated, you can't kick it or throw it as far. But I got some info from Mike Florio. He's on Pro Football Talk on NBCSports.com, and he posted a couple things on it today. He did put down the official rule. It's Rule 2 of the official NFL rulebook requires that each team make 12 primary balls available for testing 2 hours and 15 minutes before kickoff. The
Damn.
home team must make 12 backup balls available, and the visiting team may bring 12 other backup balls for the game if it's played outdoors, which in fact this was. It's in Foxborough, Massachusetts. Apparently, 11 of these 12 balls were deflated under spec. Okay, now another thing you got to look at here too is if they did it on purpose, they basically did it to themselves too, because it's a random chance of what ball you're going to get when the ball attendant gives you a ball.
Right. Right.
So I mean, come on, like it's not that huge of a deal when it's like if he did this deliberately to give his team an advantage, he basically gave his team a disadvantage as well because there's no way that you could know what ball is inflated and if your offense is going to have that ball at any given time. And what it really comes down to is that the issue it's an integrity issue in the game. Okay, that's what we're looking at here. It's
Yeah.
not something that like, oh well, not necessarily do over, but like okay, if the balls were inflated, oh the Colts would have won. Probably not. Like they basically played like crap, and the Patriots took it to them. But apparently the refs have to test these balls 2 hours and 15 minutes before the game. They have it. They're supposed to keep a close eye on it, and then they give it to the ball attendant. Okay, now so the ball attendant who is the one that brings in the balls and stuff. He's not an employee of the NFL. He is an employee of the team. So you're looking at, okay, this guy's an employee of the Patriots. So what the heck is going on here? So
Right.
there's really like three issues. Either the refs didn't properly check the balls and let the balls go into play that way. Two, they did check them, they were fine, and somehow while they were supposed to be watching them, quote unquote, someone tampered with them. Or after they gave it to the ball attendant, who I reiterate is the employee of the New England Patriots, something happened to the balls. So anyway, when it comes down to it, a rule was probably broken intentionally or unintentionally. They're going to investigate it, and of course, the NFL is only going to tell you what they want to tell you and what they found out. But I think that I hopefully with this situation, people aren't looking into it too much. I mean, I'm not a Bill Belichick fan. He's been in trouble for cheating in the past, and back in 2007, he actually left a spy at the Jets practice to like try to figure out their hand signals and stuff. So I mean, he's obviously has a track record of
Jesus
this.
Christ, that's absurd.
Yeah, it's pretty absurd, and he got a big slap on the wrist for it. Even Don Shula, who is the legendary coach of the Miami Dolphins, when they asked about him, he even said he said something like, "Oh, you mean Bella cheat?" instead of
Right.
Belichick. So he's got kind of a rep of being, he's above the game almost. And he really, I mean, a lot of people don't like him. I mean, he is very snotty and he doesn't like to talk about the game in press conferences and stuff. And I get it, the press is stupid, but really what it is here is some kind of integrity issue. And when it comes down to it, the ball attendant that I was talking about before is going to be the key figure in the investigation, according to Mike Florio, because he's not an employee of the league but of the team, and that's probably where some kind of breakdown happened here. So if you're freaking out about this and gonna go to the papers or whatever, don't really freak out about it too much. It's not gonna those balls were inflated. It's not gonna do anything to change the
Right.
outcome of that game. So
So what I'm coming away with as a non-fan, as a casual observer, is that number one, the game ultimately wouldn't have really been affected all that much by the level of inflation that these balls are reported to have had. Obviously, the what you're saying is the teams were played at such a level that the outcome would have remained the same, whether they had slightly less. Maybe it'd have been a couple of points less difference or something. It sounds like the outcome would have been all that drastically different. Not only that, but it also sounds like that there's no chance of indulging my secret wish of having them to play over again.
no, probably not. I think some of the Colts players actually did go to Twitter. I can't remember who it was, but they said, "Oh no, like, does that mean we're going to be playing in the game?" And he's like, "I better lay off these strawberry margaritas or something like that." So they're having a fun time with it. So they're probably not gonna. But
Nice.
yeah, when it comes down to it, yeah, it really wouldn't have affected it. I mean, if it was to the point where the balls were deflated so much it was going to become a factor, you probably would have noticed it. And I want to point something else out too. In this Mike Florio column he wrote, he did write that several years ago, in an effort to prevent any doctoring of balls used in the kicking game, the NFL adopted a rule that 6 new specially marked kickoff balls would be used for each game. When they're unopened boxes that the refs that were given to the refs, 2 hours and 15 minutes before the game. Now it comes into it, yeah. If a deflated ball that you're kicking for a field goal, that is probably the one area where you're going to notice a drastic difference.
For sure.
But like I said,
That makes sense.
even yeah, it makes sense. It's just simple physics in science right there.
Right.
And like it's just a random chance that you would get the ball or the other team would get the ball anyway. So it's like it just doesn't make any sense that it was done intentionally by even someone like Belichick. I mean, Belichick, I might not like him, but he's a smart guy and he's a smart football guy. I mean, he would have to know doing that would do absolutely nothing.
Right.
So yeah, you're right. What you said is what you should take away from it. It's not gonna. It just comes down to the integrity of what's going on, and they were already under fire from the way that they handled the Ray Rice scandal. With assaulting his wife in the elevator. I mean, they're under a lot of scrutiny when it comes to discipline and how they conduct these investigations. So you're going to be watching closely on that as well. So it's more of an integrity issue than it is really an outcome of the game issue. So yeah, don't take away the Patriots. And I am by no means a Patriots fan. I'm a New York Giants fan. I hate the Patriots. I can't stand the teams from Boston, so I'm not in any way trying to defend them. I'm just, looking at an unbiased view here.
Hey,
so,
fair is
yeah.
Fair.
Yep. So I mean, yeah, I think Belichick's a jerk. Maybe he did have something to do with it, but it's a stupid move if he did. So
yeah.
who knows? I guess we'll find out. When they conduct their investigation.
Well, you heard it here first, folks. The Indianapolis Colts, an organization in shambles. Uh, moving on. Well, actually, before we move on, I just did want to say that just to comment on how you said that CNN was devoting time to this story as opposed to something perhaps a bit more important or pressing on the world stage, if you will. In my opinion, that's a result of this whole need to fill the quote unquote news cycle, the 24-hour nonstop news. Like, eventually, news kind of stops. And you have to pull content from somewhere, and that's why you get all these seemingly superficial or kind of light areas of reporting on major news networks. Kind of reminds me back last year when Andrea Mitchell on MSNBC was speaking to a congresswoman live on the air and just cut her off and interrupted her for breaking news about Justin Bieber's arrest. I mean, that's where we're at right now with the state of journalism in mainstream media. So I guess it's no surprise, although it's pretty sad that it continues on and on and on. On to the next. Guess that would be the Hall of Fame selection story.
Sure. We could talk about Hall of Fame election procedures. I just thought it was kind of an interesting topic because basically what just happened on January 6th, they announced the Hall of Fame class for the Baseball Hall of Fame. And this year they're actually electing 4 players, which they have not done in a very long time. And I was kind of got interested in how do they elect people to be in like these prestigious Hall of Fames? I think arguably the Baseball Hall of Fame is probably the most well-known or popular of the 4 major sports in North America. So I kind of looked into it, and I kind of had an idea of how they were elected before. Basically, I got well, let me start off with saying they're elected by the Baseball Writers Association of America.
Right.
And what you're allowed to do is when a player becomes eligible to be elected, you can write in the person's name on a ballot and you send it in. And if your name appears on 75% or more of the ballots that are sent in, then you get elected to the Hall of Fame. Now, in order to be eligible, this is directly from the Hall of Fame website, the Baseball Hall of Fame's website. A baseball player must have been active as a player in the major leagues at some time during a period between 15 years before and ending 5 years prior to election. And the player must have played in each of 10 major league championship seasons, some part of which must have been within the period described in what I just said, the 15 years leading to and 5 years prior. So basically, once you retire, you have to wait 5 years before you're eligible, and you've had to have played in 10 full seasons in the 15-year period before you retired.
Right.
In case of death of a player that's been retired for less than 5 years, a candidate who's otherwise eligible should be eligible in the next regular election, held 6 months after the date of the death. So that doesn't really matter. So basically, once you retire 5 years later, if you played a certain amount of time, you're eligible. So they send the list of eligible players out, and if you, like I said, if you get 75% of the vote, you get elected. If you get less than 5% of the vote, then you're automatically ineligible. And the last I knew that you could be on the ballot for 15 years, and then if you weren't elected after 15 years, then you were off the ballot as well. So I was like, okay, well that's, those are pretty, I mean, it's not, there's a guideline here for when you're eligible, but the thing that got me, I was like, why do they let the Baseball Writers Association of America do it? Now, it makes sense because, and I was like, well, let me look into this and see how you become a member of the Baseball Writers Association. So I went to their website,
Right.
and it said, basically, active membership in the association shall be reserved for persons who meet the following qualifications, okay? You have to be a member of the staff of a daily newspaper, which covers by staff reporter at home and by a staff reporter or special correspondent on the road 75% of the scheduled games of major league teams in its area. And in the case of a chapter in which 2 or more major league teams are based, it shall be sufficient for a paper to cover by staff reporters 75% of the home games of those teams. So basically, you have to be like a writer, hence Baseball Writers Association of America. You can also be a member. There's like, if you're a statistician who supply baseball records to daily newspapers, members of that qualify under Section A and B, regularly assigned sports staff members of foreign language daily newspapers or associations of press. There's a lot of ways you can be eligible, but a lot of them are people that were, like I said, writing for a paper. And you can also be a daily contributor to a website that covers baseball as well. And that's one of the things that they kind of added on later on because, the internet's everywhere. So
Yeah.
in this case, so these people that write about baseball, you kind of have to say that, okay, they knew what they're talking about, or like at least they cover baseball to the point where an editor lets them write about it. So I kind of see where that's, I guess, a good body of people. And because I think if you used like, veterans of some, like of baseball, and you let them do, there might be some kind of like feuds that you didn't know about, or some kind of resentment, so people might not elect it. But so that there's that. So there was another point I wanted to make about that.
It's amazing that they threw in the internet. I mean, I guess they had to, but with newspapers kind of fighting and railing against their continued crumbling and losing of ground to online journalism and stuff. I find that interesting that they made a exception for that. I mean, like I said, apparently, there was no way to fight that, but it's an interesting note on that
Yeah.
subject.
In adding to the voting procedure too, according to the election process rules for the Hall of Fame gives the Writers Association. We talked about the eligibility and everything like that. Basically, the only criteria they give you for voting is says voting shall be based on the player's record, playing ability, integrity, sportsmanship, character, and contributions to the teams on which the player played. And then it says no automatic elections based on performance, such as batting average of 400 or more in 1 year, pitching a perfect game, or similar outstanding achievement shall be permitted. So
That's good.
there isn't really like a set number of stats where they're saying, okay, you kind of look at it like historically, like if you were a pitcher and you had 300 wins in your career, you were basically automatically elected. If you hit 500 home runs as a batter, you were automatically elected. 3,000 hits is kind of wishy-washy, but typically you're elected if you get 3,000. Like there's milestones that like basically if you get to it, then you're probably going to get elected to the Hall of Fame. Now it says you can't just use one stat to do it, and it's interesting that they put in the part about integrity and sportsmanship because I don't know if you realize or not, but a lot of players that have these stats aren't getting elected because of the steroid era.
Right.
You've got Barry Bonds, who's got the record for home runs in a season and his career, only got like 40 or 50% of the ballots last year. Roger Clemens, who's got like 350 some wins, he has numerous Cy Young awards,
Yep.
hasn't been elected yet because they're all implicated in steroids. And I think that's good because it right there, these writers are saying, you know what, that's not integrity, that's cheating. So I'm kind of glad they're not elected, and it kind of stinks because they have the stats to do it, but are those stats have a little asterisk next to them like they always talk about? So yeah, moving on, I looked at another popular sport of football. Basically, the Football Hall of Fame election procedures, they kind of just say, well, here's a committee, and you get to pick people that you think are going to be elected. I don't like that rule because that's basically like a popularity contest to me.
Yeah, it's way
It's
too
not.
easy to corrupt it.
Yeah, it's way too easy to corrupt it. I'm not going to get into it in too much detail, but it's kind of the same thing. The committee, now their committees consist of one media representative from each pro football city, with two from New York because there's two teams.
Right.
In as much as the city has two teams in the National Football League, like I said. 33rd member is representative of the Pro Football Writers of America, and there are 13 at-large delegates. And there's actually a list of people who are on this committee. And, some of them are people that I've heard of, and it makes sense that they would be a part of it because they have something to do with football. Like there's an analyst on ESPN. His name's Sal Palantonio. He's a pretty smart football analyst. He's on the panel. He's not really affiliated with any of these media outlets, but he's on ESPN. So there's people here, and I've some of them I've never heard of. But so basically, they just like sit around as well. Here's like a bunch of people, and then we're gonna vote on it. Because like the selection committee is different from the actual. Because like the selection committee is smaller than the committee that actually elects it. So the selection committee gives you the names, and then the rest of the committee votes on it, and you have to get 80% approval from the board basically to get in.
Right.
So the only thing I don't like about that is that it's not. There isn't like okay, you've had to play this many seasons, you've been retired for 5 years, you're eligible. It's like they pick who's eligible, like you said. It's kind of like a corrupting. It could be a corrupting thing. Now, as far as I know, usually people that have merit and played the game well and exhibited like sportsmanship and skill have been elected. So it could be, but I just don't like the procedure in that respect. So it's kind of interesting just to kind of get a brief glimpse of that. Now, another Hall of Fame that has nothing to do with sports, I find this to be kind of vague when it comes to their criteria is the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Now, are you familiar with their procedures at all?
Yeah, I mean, I know that it's basically a lot of record executives, behind the scenes music industry people. Jan Wenner, the founder of Rolling Stone, had a big piece, big pull on the board who decided the nominees for a long time. I'm not sure that he still has as much, but it's a lot of A&R guys, a lot of executives that are really high up, that I understand anyway, who make these decisions as to who gets in and who doesn't. Some writers, from what I understand too, kind of like the Baseball Hall of Fame. But the important thing to note is, and I mean, there's a lot made out of this every year. At the end of the day, the people who essentially matter most in something like music, the fans, the people who buy the albums, don't get a say whatsoever. And none of these Hall of Fame processes really open themselves to fans like that. But I always wondered why it couldn't be like a 2 or 3 way split. You know,
Mm-hmm.
get a consensus from the writers or whatever, get a consensus from the industry professionals who work with these people, get a consensus from the fans, pool it all together, maybe take the average or something like that. It seems to me that type of process would be a little more fair than, just
Mm-hmm.
meeting in some fucking shiny tabled boardroom behind closed doors and just going like, this is my decree, and
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
Well, from what I've got, what I got from the website, basically there isn't really a lot of criteria involved to be elected or selected to be elected. It says artists become eligible for induction 25 years after the release of their first record. Okay, well that makes sense. It
Right.
gives them some time to be, in the industry, like kind of, feel it out, see how well they do. It says criteria include the influence and significance of the artist's contributions to development or perpetuation of rock and roll. And that's pretty vague, and it's not really something that you can put a number on. I mean, yeah, you can talk about how many records somebody sold or something like that, but how do you measure someone's influence and the significance of their contribution without really being an opinion based system? I mean, you can't really, unless you say, well, they sold X amount of albums, but I
Right.
mean, what does that really mean nowadays, too? And what exactly is rock and roll? Because some of these people that are inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, I wouldn't really consider rock and roll music either. So, I mean, there's a whole lot of, like, generalities here that are hard to kind of wrap my head around. Moving on, it does say the foundation's nominating committee selects nominees each year in the performer category. Says ballots are then sent to an international voting body of more than 600 artists, historians, and members of the music industry, like you were just touching on. And the performers who receive the highest number of votes are inducted. And it says they generally induct 5 to 7 performers each year, and they don't even tell you how many votes you need. Basically, it's like, if okay, this band got the most, we'll put them in. What about the next one? Okay, we'll put them in. So then they just kind of arbitrarily cut it off at some point. So it's like, well, they left that person out, but
Right.
they were eighth, and we only decided to do 7. So it does say in 2012 that the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame did open the voting to fans around the world, but
Okay.
here's the catch.
Right.
It says the top 5 nominees as voted by fans count for 1 ballot entry,
There
which
you
is
go.
weighted the same as individual ballot entries submitted by the members of the international voting body. So you sort of get a say, but not really. But
Yeah.
yeah, it's
Well,
the same thing. I mean, it's basically a popularity contest. I mean, like I said, there's artists in there that I wouldn't even consider rock and roll music. I mean, is it just music in general, or is it really rock and roll?
right.
So
Well, to me, like the guidelines are designed to be vague on purpose. I've read an explanation, or one of the potential explanations for that is that they say that they do it that way to avoid anything becoming a popularity contest, which is kind of a joke. Actually,
you're right.
they bring up like the Oscars and what happens with like lobbying and all that stuff. They want to avoid that for this, which is fair enough. But I can like I said that the other like the sports Hall of Fames don't open things up to fans in that way, and I could sort of understand that more in that world. I mean, there's a big difference between a physical contest, athletic competition versus art. All art is subjective. I mean, there's no gray area really whether somebody, is an outstanding athlete or not. Sure, you can argue the finer points, the subtleties of their performances, but in the general sense, whether or not someone is great in the world of sports. I mean, I feel like that's true as well for a lot of things in music, but it's a lot more subjective. It's a lot more based on taste and opinion. To me, that's why it's more important to bring a fan vote. And now that you read that, I remember hearing something about that they were opening up to fans. But I mean, I think that's why I forgot about it, because it's such like an afterthought. Like, oh
Yeah.
yeah, here we'll throw you a little nugget from the table that we're all feasting at here, but it doesn't really count for anything when it's all said and done. I mean, is that one ballot's worth of fan vote really going to sway something that's in consideration one way or another? I doubt it.
Actually, I don't think it's like a vote. I think it's just like to nominate somebody.
Right. So there you go.
I mean,
That's even
it,
less effective.
yeah, it's not because that's the thing because it's nominee voting to fans around the world. So the top 5 nominees is voted by the fans count for one ballot entry. So basically, if X artist gets voted in by the fans, that's not necessarily mean they're going to get in. They're going to put it on the ballot for whoever behind the scenes is voting on it. So then they're on the ballot, and then they can just not vote for them.
Right.
Usually popular opinion would trump something like that, but I don't know. I mean, I think it is. I think it's the Illuminati.
Well,
But
as a Kiss fan, I just have to say that they're among the more high profile examples of bands that were shunned from the Hall of Fame for years past their eligibility. They've been eligible since 1998, and it took them another 16 years. They kind of publicly were known for taking the opinion that they honestly didn't give a shit. The fans are who matters and all that stuff, and they don't need the validation of a bunch of suits or whatever, which is fair enough. So I have to kind of agree with the position Paul Stanley, Paul Stanley took on the night of their actual induction. He actually kind of stuck to his guns on that, which I respected a lot. Like, it's one thing to say something against the Hall of Fame when you're not allowed in it, but I think in the past we've seen a lot of people who've sort of been that way kind of change their tune once they get the invite to the party, if you will.
Right.
So one of the things he said in his acceptance speech was, that it's more of a special night for the fans than for the band themselves, because it really meant vindication for Kiss fans who've been fighting upstream since Kiss has been around. It's sort of been, kind of a joke or whatever. From magazines like Rolling Stone for a lot of years, Kiss was sort of seen as not serious. Even though, if you listen to their music, there really isn't a lot out there that's more cut and dried rock and roll by definition than especially their 70s stuff. I mean, that is that is rock and roll music to the bone. Meanwhile, in the years that Kiss isn't getting in, we've got rap artists and country singer and folk people, and like that's all well and good because there are great artists in all of those areas. But when you read the criteria of contributing to rock and roll music, I mean, I think an argument can be made that those people aren't necessarily people who belong in there, and if they do, certainly not ahead of bands like Kiss, who are strictly rock and roll. But anyway, so one of the things Paul Stanley said was it was vindication for the fans, and also that towards the end he stressed that it's the fans, the people who pay for the tickets, who buy the albums, and the people on the committee typically are people who don't do those things. So it's a great point. I agree with him. Whether or not anything's going to change anytime soon is something I doubt. But I think it's good to be aware of all the sides of the issue, which is, I suppose, is the point of talking about it to begin with.
Well, yeah, I mean, I agree with that totally. I mean, it's kind of funny when you mentioned it's for the fans. I kind of wonder if that's ever going to happen to Pete Rose, the old baseball player, as you know, is on the baseball's ineligible list, and he's not allowed to be put into the Hall of Fame. That's one of their criteria for being left off the ballot. And basically is because he broke a rule about gambling. He admitted that he did it. He didn't bet like against his team and because he was a manager at the time.
Right.
It's never been proven that he bet against his team and then did stuff to lose the game.
Right.
As the manager. So yeah, he broke a rule and he's on the ineligible list. It's kind of a sham if you ask me.
Absolutely.
I think these people like Barry Bonds, Roger Clemens, Sammy Sosa, people like that were implicated in the congressional, investigation of steroids in baseball, and they've been linked to all these places. I think that's more of a reason to get put on an ineligible list than gambling. Sorry, but I kind of wonder about that too because he talks about it a lot as well. And I don't know if there was a commercial he just did for Skechers, and he is basically making fun of the fact that he's not in the Hall of Fame. It was something like he was standing in the hall wearing his shoes, and his wife like told him to take off his shoes. He's like, man, I can't even be in the hall of my own home or something like that. Or like, here I am wearing my Skechers in the hall. So it was like obviously like a play on that. So I kind of wonder what if he ever gets in, what his acceptance speech is going to be, because you're right, there is a more of a cut and dry criteria for an athlete, because you do have all these stats you can point at, to say, well, yeah, Pete Rose has the most hits of any player in baseball that's ever played the game. Of course he's going to be in the Hall of Fame.
Absolutely.
And and it's like, no, he's ineligible. And that's another thing that because the new commissioner is actually taking over. So my dad and I were actually talking about that the other day. We were like, do you think he's going to overturn the decision or not? So we'll wait and see. But yeah, I kind of agree with Paul Stanley. I think they take, I think, the one thing out of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame procedure that would make it more legitimate in my eyes, and that's the ban. So I don't know. Well, I guess we'll wait and see if that changes too, because I know that was they've talked about that for years, about how they didn't really care that they were in it because it's just a bunch of bullshit anyway. So right. I mean, it's pretty cool if you go there, I guess, and see all the memorabilia. But I mean, actually seeing who's elected to the Hall of Fame, I don't know if that's really my bag with that. So all right,
that's funny. I hadn't actually heard about that Pete Rose commercial. I'm gonna have to look it up. That's hilarious.
Yeah, I think it was Skechers. Yeah, check it out sometime. If we find it, we'll put a link on our Facebook page too.
Right.
As well.
In my opinion, he absolutely belongs in the Hall of Fame. It's embarrassing and it's ridiculous. And hopefully, like you said, some new blood in the commissioner's office will change that. Fingers and everything else is crossed for that. It's high time.
Well, that goes back to this whole football deflating scandal. The whole gambling thing. It's not really a matter of whether he, bet against his team and threw games to lose. It's an integrity issue. You can't gamble when you're in a position like that. But, I mean, like, okay, prove to me that he threw the game, then fine. I can see how he's ineligible. That's a dishonest and immoral thing to do. But he never did that. Like, supposedly he bet on his teams to win. Yeah, so, like, how are you telling me that's wrong?
That's always been my understanding, is that he bet on his team. Like... Yeah, I mean, he bet for them to do great. Like, I mean, that's, in some ways, that's the ultimate expression of self-confidence.
Exactly. And it's like, yeah, of course we're going to win.
And to me, I never understood, through all these years. This happened when he was a manager. I don't understand how that affects his career as a player, his achievements as a player. I mean, isn't that what we're talking about here?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, they do induct, managers or... Right. Umpires that they thought were like great umpires. I mean, I get that too, and those people should be in there as well. I mean, yeah, his achievements as a manager, as far as I know, were pretty lackluster anyway. It's like how he played as a player, and he brought a little bit of a grit to the baseball game too. I mean, they called him Charlie Hustle. He was always willing to run into somebody, get in a fight with somebody. It was great, but we're not talking about hockey, but
that's also another topic right for discussion, is how baseball itself has changed over the years, and that era and that style of play is no more.
Yeah. Yep. Exactly. Well, I'm actually reading a pretty interesting book about Ted Williams, the famous Red Sox player. It's a huge book, and I mean, it gets into like every little facet of this guy's life, and there's a lot of things I never realized about this guy. He's half Mexican, which nobody ever knew really. And he never really talked about it because he was embarrassed, and he
kind of like Mitt Romney.
Yeah, kind of. Well, he thought that he would get unfair treatment because he saw, how people of Hispanic and Mexican descent and everything were treated, and he never really came out with it. He was like a big womanizer who didn't really have a lot of respect for women, kind of stemming back to like his the issues he had with his mom. I mean, there's a whole bunch of awesome stuff in this book, and it's kind of weird when you see someone that's so idolized as like probably arguably the greatest hitter to ever play the game.
For sure.
Just to kind of get that glimpse into like what he was like, and he was terrible. I mean, he just had these violent tempers, and he hated the press. Like, he just couldn't stand the baseball writers, which is funny because that goes into who elects him into the Hall of Fame. Right. But he was a big proponent of integrating baseball with other races, and he obviously made it into the Hall of Fame. So yeah, there's a lot about his life and career I didn't know, so that's an interesting topic, but we don't have to talk about that at length.
Well, it's just interesting that you bring up the type of guy he was off the field, or maybe even on the field, with him and Pete Rose kind of discussing the rougher era of baseball in general. I honestly have never really been all that hugely against steroids or made a big deal about it being in baseball. I mean, it seems like there's more people doing it than aren't anymore anyway, and it almost seems like you're never going to be able to weed it all out. You're never going to be able to undo what's been done. I think that for a long time between Ted Williams' era and the modern era, there was this big push, to really kind of sanitize or make family friendly baseball and all sports, really. I mean, but baseball in particular has always been America's national pastime or whatever. And we have to remember that these are not necessarily guys who belong on, Sesame Street or whatever. Like, this isn't necessarily meant to be children's entertainment. Sure, a lot of kids grow up, and us included, idolizing these guys, but at the end of the day, they're humans. They're adult human men who are degenerate gamblers or drug abusers or what have you. I think it can be said that our favorite team, the '86 Mets, are some of the most legendary scoundrels ever to play the game.
Yeah, we like it.
Absolutely, and I just think that era of baseball was better for the sport in general and the end result in general than all these efforts to kind of clamp down and make it sparkling clean and everything for the whole family or whatever.
Well, and speaking of the '86 Mets, I think they had 4 bench clearing brawls that whole season. I mean, you're lucky if you see like 1 or 2 a year from any team in general, but they had 4. I mean, that's crazy. Those guys were nuts. And they're actually they're legendary for destroying the airline that they were flying home on after they beat the Houston Astros in the championship series to go to the World Series. And they were crazy and oozing it up. But I think a lot of it too, like you were saying about the steroids, even though like Barry Bonds isn't like elected, he still was on 50% of the writers' ballots, So I think, I mean, he's only been eligible for a few years. I mean, fast forward 10 years from now, who knows what the stigma surrounding this is going to be, and if like they're going to want, if they're still going to look at it the same way and say he cheated, or like, just it's over and done with it. He's got all these records, put him in, because you can kind of tell where he went from non-steroid user to steroid user, because he was kind of a thin guy. Then all of a sudden he was like the Hulk.
Yeah, exactly.
But he was still a really good baseball player before that. So my thought process is, why did he do that in the first place? But as you get older, you start to lose your skill. But he was a good player before that. So it's like, can you take his merits and say, well, projected over the next 10 years, he would have done about this. So it's gonna, at some point it's gonna be a moot issue, but it isn't right now. That's the problem. And you still have to have skill to hit a baseball. I mean, just being jacked just makes you hit it really far. But you still have to have the skill to hit it and play the game. It's not like you take steroids and you're a baseball player.
Yeah, exactly.
So we shall see. Time will tell.
Indeed.
All right. So we did promise we'd have some things that were not the original Star Wars trilogy that we actually liked about some Star Wars stuff here. From what I understand, like you have a couple things on the top of your head. I actually have a list because I'm that meticulous and passionate about my Star Wars. So if you want, I mean, is there anything in particular that jumps out at you? And if it's on my list, I'll let you know. We can talk about it, or how do you want to go through this list here?
I mean, I did sort of make my own list. It's not really comprehensive. It was a struggle for me to come up with 5 whole things not related directly to or a part of directly the original trilogy that I thought that I really enjoyed.
Right.
But I eventually did it. I mean, do you want me to divulge the whole list, or do you want us each to go start at 5 and compare what we came up with, or?
Sure. And if if your 5 is like my 5, that's cool. If not, if it's on my list, we can talk about it. I'll tell you where it is. I just wanted to point out too that when I say something that's not the Star Wars trilogy, I don't mean like another movie or like a TV show like exclusively. As we go through the list, you'll see I have a book on here. I've got some video games on here. I do in fact have a TV show on here. So I just wanted to kind of let everybody know I wasn't going to be like everything that's been put on TV or a movie. So sure, let's start off with your number 5. What do you have for that?
My number 5 is the Nintendo 64 game Star Wars Rogue Squadron.
Okay, that's actually not on my list. I think because I kind of forgot about it. But that game would probably go under my honorable mention category, because my honorable mentions basically encompass video games as well.
Right.
But sure, yeah, go ahead and talk about that. I do remember that now. That was a pretty decent game.
I was never really huge into Star Wars video games, or honestly, video games, period, really. I've always enjoyed video games in general, and there were always certain ones that I really liked and got into, but I never considered myself a gamer per se. But back in the days of Nintendo 64, that was probably the console that I got most into at the time. I don't know, it was, it blew everything else away, in my opinion. A lot of people went towards the PlayStation side of things, but I mean, Nintendo 64 was double the bits of PlayStation originally. So, and I was always a cartridge guy anyway because I
Yeah.
always hated the loading screens. But anyway, in that time, yeah, Rogue Squadron came out, and I just liked the story idea. I liked that it explored characters that were, in fact, in the original trilogy themselves, but this is a separate story outside of that. But characters that you kind of sort of heard of or were aware of, but you got to kind of make heroes out of them separately. I think it was a really well designed game. At the time it came out, I think it came out in '98 or around there
Right.
when episode one, the first prequel, was sort of just over the horizon. So I remember that even though the vehicle selection was primarily stuff that came from the original trilogy, there were codes that you could put in to get some of those episode one vehicles as sort of like a little sneak preview of what they could do. And I know actually even though I'm not a huge fan of the prequel trilogy, there's I think it was called a Naboo starfighter from episode one that you could put in a
Right.
code and get on this game. I always put that in because it was the fastest, lightest ship. Basically, I think you took the role of Wedge Antilles, if I'm remembering correctly, in this game, who was kind of a important but somewhat minor character in the original trilogy, one of the rebel pilots. And he just led a separate group of X-wing fighters or various ship flyers around different missions around the galaxy, and there was certain tasks you had to perform or whatever. And I don't know, I just always had a lot of fun exploring the worlds, and it was a really comprehensive game on a system at that time.
Yeah, I agree with all that. I do remember the 64. I mean, I think that had some really groundbreaking landmark games to it. I know one that we talked about or we played a lot was that WCW NWO Revenge game, and then of
Greatest
course
wrestling game ever.
yeah, that game was awesome, and it had the James Bond GoldenEye, which
Absolutely.
really I think revolutionized the first person shooter multiplayer aspect of video games. That wasn't really a prevalent thing, and then when that James Bond game came out, whatever. We're not talking about that, but yeah, I remember. I don't remember if you actually were Wedge in the game. I know that in the lore of the Star Wars universe, that was Wedge's thing was Rogue Squadron.
Right.
And you're right. He was a minor but really important character. I mean, he was like the only fighter pilot besides Luke that survived all three movies. It seems like the
Yeah.
rebel pilots were like a dime a dozen, and he was actually the leader of the fighter squadron that attacked the final Death Star with Lando Calrissian, and he was actually one of the only sort of secondary characters that if you notice in the end of Return of the Jedi and the celebration scene, he's actually in it, and he like shakes Luke's hand.
Yep.
So you kind of like, he's actually someone that they respect. He's just not depicted, and I think it's great when you explore a character like that to kind of get more of a background. And I know there's actually a series of novels called Rogue Squadron 2. He was the still like the general, like the leader of them, but the characters were like different pilots and stuff. I'm not sure if it followed the actions of the game or not, but I know that was a big thing for a while was the Rogue Squadron. It was like they were the cream of the crop, if you will.
Right.
Okay. That was a pretty good game. I remember that. I forgot all about it.
Oh.
My number 5 was, first and foremost, it was a book. It kind of turned out to be more of like a multimedia project. It was called Shadows of the Empire. The book was written by an author named Steve Perry, not to be confused with Steve Perry from Journey, but he released the book in 1996. And it was really considered a multimedia project because it consisted of the book, and then there was a video game that went with it, and there was like a bunch of comic book series or comic books that came out. There was other merchandise, and I remember there were like special action figures that were released from this too. And it was kind of weird that they did that because we're talking about
It really is, yeah.
a property. Yeah, you're talking about a property that wasn't depicted in movie form, and you're like, where did these action figures come from? But yeah, it was really the last major multimedia release that Lucasfilm did before the special editions were released the following year in 1997.
Yep.
What I liked about it, Well, actually, I'll tell you I'll go through the things I didn't really like about it, but in this case, what I liked outweighed what I didn't like, so that's kind of why it's on my list. I didn't like there was a character because this takes place. Well, let me start off with this. It takes place between The Empire Strikes Back and The Return of the Jedi. So in this time period, as you know, Han Solo is frozen in carbonite. He's being taken to Jabba the Hutt, so he's not even a character in this book
Right.
because he's out for the count. He's one and done Solo right there. But they introduced a character called Dash Rendar, and he is basically the carbon copy of Han
Yeah.
Solo with a different name.
Exactly. He's Han
So
Solo.
I was like, dude, like that's just stupid because like I know you want like that smuggler swashbuckler type character, but you can't do it because Han's not in there. So I think it's just kind of pointless. I mean, he did have a purpose in the plot of the book, but I was kind of like, this is kind of chintzy, this is kind of cheesy. Let's get rid of that. We talked about this before. It had obvious like throwaway characters where like you've never heard of these characters, like Dash Rendar fits right into that throwaway character because like you never see him or hear about him, so they have to do something with him. And I think they kind of vaguely killed him off at the end of the book or something like that. But what I did like about it was one of the other throwaway characters I actually enjoyed. He was basically they introduced like this cunning villain, and he would actually be utilized in other expanded universe projects in books. Like he'd be mentioned in books and stuff like that.
Right.
His name was Prince Shizor, and basically he was the head of a galactic crime syndicate. They were called Black Sun, and they were actually in league with the Emperor. His goal in the book was basically to replace Darth Vader as the Emperor's right hand man. Like he wanted to be in the position that Darth Vader was because like he was making money off this guy.
That's
He just
right.
wanted Vader out of the way. Now, of course, how the hell are you gonna get rid of Vader? I mean, he's a pretty he's a badass Sith
Of course.
mofo. But it was an interesting dynamic to introduce a character like that because you never really saw this like seedy underworld of the universe yet. You only see like it's like bad versus good. It's the Empire versus the Rebels. It's military, fight, fight, fight. You don't really see the goings on, and obviously in a situation like this, there's going to be criminals and people that are taking advantage of the system. So I thought it was kind of an interesting element to throw into the book, and I really liked, he was a pretty cunning and evil character. It was weird because I kind of wanted to read the book before I went into this. I can't remember what happened to him, so I'm like, crap. But
Yeah, I really can't either. I didn't even think.
yeah, and like I said, they utilized him in other books. And the ones that I saw him in they took place before these events happened. So I'm not sure if he was killed or not. I can't remember, but I know that he obviously didn't replace Vader as the Emperor's right hand man. So something happened to him. A couple other things I liked about it. It kind of explained how Leia acquired the Bouche bounty hunter costume that she utilizes to rescue Han Solo in Return of the Jedi. It goes through the story of how she got that. It kind of further explored Luke Skywalker continuing his training on his own and what's leading up to the events of him making his own lightsaber again. So I thought it was really good. And overall, I mean, it was a well written book. And I've said before that some of these things don't have the feel of Star Wars to them. This one kind of did. I kind of felt like that's something that Leia would say. That's something that Luke would say. I didn't feel like it was this weird dialogue that they would talk about something. And it was fun because it took place in the time of the original trilogy, so you couldn't really muck it up too much to screw up the story. It kind of had to have a path, like you were at point A to point B, and stuff happened, but it had to get to B still. So they couldn't really mess it up that much. And I thought it tied those two movies together pretty well. I mean, it's like two big things that you never hear about, like how did Luke get his lightsaber back, and
Right.
where did you get that costume from? So that was pretty cool that they explained that. The video game was pretty fun. It wasn't anywhere near as fun as the Rogue Squadron game I remember, but it was still pretty good. So that is Shadows of the Empire was one of mine. Did you have that on your list at all?
Yeah, oddly enough, that was my number 3. So
Okay.
as much as you liked it, I guess I liked it 2 notches more.
That's all right.
Pretty much because of all the stuff you mentioned. I felt like you did get a little taste in Empire Strikes Back with the group of bounty hunters assembled by Darth Vader and with the Jabba the Hutt palace stuff in Return of the Jedi. You get a small taste of that seedy underbelly that sort of exists between and outside of the Empire or the Rebellion.
That's a good point.
I feel like those scenes and those characters are kind of limited in the original trilogy, and it was probably smart to do that because they add kind of this texture and flavor that kind of keeps everything from being, like you said, just straight up good and bad and extremely boring after a while. But I think it was smart to limit them because it leaves you wanting more, and that's exactly what Shadows of the Empire did for me. Was it did feel very authentic. It felt like, damn, I wish they'd made this movie. I wish they'd make it now. At the time, it was 1996, I think. I remember thinking like, oh, they can get away with making this now. And I think that's probably the mark of a successful property is that you can picture it so well that you you want to see it realized. And I think that's why they were able to successfully branch off into not just the book, also like the video game. I'm pretty sure that was the first Star Wars related video game for the Nintendo 64. I vaguely remember playing that right after I got the system. I think it was 2 or 3 years before Rogue Squadron. And I liked it, but like you said, yeah, it wasn't nearly as good as Rogue Squadron. I didn't really, even though Dash Rendar as a character was pretty obviously their kind of placeholder for Han Solo. I didn't mind it in a lot of ways because I don't know, they made him. I felt like I guess I fixate on certain areas of Star Wars that maybe other people overlook. I felt like the character names, the new character names in this property, Shadows of the Empire, were a little more maybe the last of the believably ridiculous character names before like the prequel trilogy took things into just a crazy like over the top collection of syllables. I believe Dash Rendar, that's not too
Right.
ridiculous. I believe Prince Shizor for whatever reason. It's harder for me to believe what is it, Ahsoka Tano or whatever the the one is that's
Yeah.
supposed to be or Anakin's apprentice. That's just one example. There's a billion of them out there. Asadi Ventress or something. I don't know. It's hard for me to remember these names. But anyway, I mean, so that was a part of it for me. I did get the toys because the year before this came out, I started again collecting action figures. I started with Star Wars, so I bought right into that aspect of it. And in a lot of ways, I think releasing toys from this, even though you pointed out that it was sort of a weird move because there really wasn't a children's property to sustain it, I think it tested the water in two areas for them. One was the viability of the more adult based market for action figures. And number two was the viability of always having some type of Star Wars product on the shelves. And I think both of them must have succeeded in spades because here we are today, where for the last 20 years now, there has been some type of Star Wars toy available. And today, more than ever, the variety of Star Wars toys available is kind of just staggering. But yeah, that was my number three, so I will have to be one short.
Okay, no problem. Well, let's go to your number 4 and see what we got.
Number four for me is a single character from the prequel trilogy, and one of my favorite, like one of the only things from the prequel trilogy that I really enjoyed, even though looking back on it, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. The character Qui-Gon Jinn is my favorite thing from the prequels and one of my favorite Star Wars characters. Period. I don't know. I thought again it left you. They only used him for that first movie and killed him off. Spoiler alert if you haven't seen it for the last 18 years or whatever it's been, 16 I guess. But yeah, I thought Liam Neeson did a great job. I thought he looked kind of like a swashbuckler kind of guy, which I always am a sucker for. You never really heard about him before, and so that makes me question his real, whether he was just pretty much slapped in at the last minute for this movie or not. I just think the way he was portrayed, he was just kind of a legend unto himself, and I really enjoyed the badassness of him. And because they only limited him to that one movie, it definitely left me wanting more. So yeah, that's my number four.
I'll put a couple points on that. I do like that character as well, and I think because Liam Neeson, I think overall, he's a great actor. He is a good voice actor, even in things you don't see him. But I think he brought a lot of credibility to the prequel trilogy or that movie specifically because of his acting ability. Because as you noticed, a lot of everybody else's acting ability was somewhat lacking for some reason.
Yeah.
But he brought the credibility to it for being, just the type of actor that he is. And I think what I liked most about him is that you have this universal struggle between good and evil. In the original trilogy, it's Luke is good, Vader's bad, then he's kind of like not bad, then he's good again. It kind of further explores like this gray area between what it means to be just a good guy all the time or just a bad guy all the time, because you kind of get the sense that his character doesn't really do what he's told to a lot of the time. You know, he's
Right.
kind of like the rebel character. You know, he doesn't necessarily agree with the will of the other Jedi's. You know, he kind of does his own thing. And I thought that was a really unique way of looking at a character that is a Jedi, you know. And it's weird because he ends up being, you know, the first master of Obi-Wan Kenobi, who you kind of feel throughout his whole life is the good guy. There's no, you know, gray area with him. He's always does the right thing. But Qui-Gon's kind of like, you know what, don't just follow the book. You know, sometimes you got to go outside the box, and that's kind of what I got from his character, and I like that a lot about him.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's probably one of like two or three new characters that I liked from the prequel trilogy. So that's a good pick actually. So kudos to you, sir.
Why, thanks.
No problem. All right, my number 4. Actually, I kind of grouped a couple of things into one category. There are a couple of mobile app-based games that I play that are Star Wars related, and I put them. Well, actually, let me start off. The prominent one I play is called the Force Collection. Basically, it's like a mobile trading card game, and it's a trading card game, not like Magic the Gathering or anything. Basically, you just have a card that has certain powers, and whoever has the strongest set of powers, like the strongest deck, wins like a battle or something. Now, I put these on here because they don't get too complicated or submersive, which I think is good sometimes, especially for people like us that are generally disappointed in stuff outside of Star Wars that wasn't the original trilogy. And sometimes you just need like a little bit of a fix, and you don't want to get into it too much. Some things I don't like about it, I mean, yeah, it has those characters in it that, we didn't like, there's a bunch of Jar Jar Binks cards and stupid crap like that. But I think when it comes to just getting a fix, it's really distracting for some reason. I don't know why. There's just something about wanting to get like the really rare cards that are powerful and cool looking, and you can play, and it's easy because it's not like I'm carrying around cards with me. It's on my game. It's on my phone. It's
Right.
electronic. It's one of those classic pay-to-win games. Like you got to put money into it to get like the decent cards. I mean, they'll give you free cards and stuff here and there, but rarely do you get anything good. But yeah, there isn't really a whole much to go into about it. It's kind of a Star Wars fix I get when I don't want to think about it too much. There's like another game I've got on my Kindle. I think it's called Galactic Defense. It's like your typical tower defense game, they call it, where you just like set up towers that are really powerful and have to shoot the characters that are coming through and you have to stop them. But yeah, I kind of like those mobile games. I'm probably assuming that you don't have any of those on your list.
No, I never even. Nah, I'm not really big into
Yeah.
phone games in general,
Mhm.
and I never even honestly have heard of those. So yeah, I have no experience with that. But I mean, you make it sound interesting.
Yeah, I mean it's. I only found out about the Force Collection. I was on Facebook one day, and it was like one of those suggested apps things. So they see your profile, and then I probably wrote something about Star Wars in it. So I checked it out, and yeah, it's really not. There isn't really a lot of thinking involved either, which is good.
Right.
Like I said before, but it's like I said, I get a little bit of a fix from it. It's really ridiculously distracting. If like you get into it, I'll be playing it for like an hour. I'm like, crap, what am I doing? It's just a card game. It's not even like you do anything. You just build a deck of cards and fight other people, and sometimes they have events. But yeah, that's I put that on my list. It's kind of it's very vague, but I mean, I was kind of stretching for things to put on my list too at some point. So, all right, what did you have for number 3?
Well, number 3 was Shadows of the Empire for me, so I think we have to
Oh,
defer
right,
to
sorry.
number 3.
Yeah. All right, my number 3. I'll just go into mine. Were a couple of PC games. That's personal computer people that we had, or well, I had that we played that I'm sure you remember.
Yeah.
I grouped them together. One was called Rebel Assault,
Yep.
and the other one was called X-Wing. I'll go into a little bit of background about these games first, and we can talk about them. Rebel Assault was originally released by LucasArts, which is their like video game development company. Released in 1993. Basically, it was what you call a rail shooter game. And that means your character or vehicle, it follows like a predetermined path.
Yep.
That you can't really veer off from. It's a continuous thing. Like you have to fight things as they come up, and you can't stop. It's that's basically what it is as a rail shooter. It followed a fictional character called Rookie One, who's a farm boy from Tatooine in the same fashion of Luke Skywalker. So it's pretty obvious what they were doing.
Yeah, they were stretching that pretty far.
Yeah, let's not stretch it here, LucasArts. But the game did receive a lot of poor reviews, and I can understand why. Being that I'm older and I've played so many more video games, I still do play video games, and I could see how when that came out, it wasn't really well received. But what I liked about it, it allowed me to be a part of something that I had kind of fantasized about as a kid for a long time.
Yeah.
I finally got to be in a game where I could sort of control an X-wing and shoot it. I could, go through the base on Hoth and like shoot stormtroopers, and that was awesome. Okay, so yeah, I mean the events of the game kind of took place around episode 4 in like that Hoth scene from episode 5. They replaced certain characters, like when the Millennium Falcon comes and saves you at the Death Star run. It's actually like another pilot, that's not Han Solo.
Right.
But I put that on the list because, like I said, it was one of the first times that I was actually involved. I could be a part of that universe. It released the same year was a game called X-Wing. Now, this, in fact, was not a rail shooter. It was basically like a flight simulator. So you got to control an X-Wing and other spaceships. Like if you had there were add-ons. I actually had the collector's edition. So I had like X-Wing, and then I had like the B-Wing add-on pack. So you could fly an X-Wing, a B-Wing, an A-Wing, all these different fighters. But you actually got to control, like, how fast you were going. You got to control where your shields were. You got to control what kind of spread that your lasers would shoot. And you had to complete like mission objectives. Like one I remember was you had to like protect a rebel cruiser from a TIE fighter attack and could jump to hyperspace. So you're flying around, and all of a sudden the TIE fighters come in. You got to intercept. You got to fight them, and you get to actually control your flight. Which was way cooler than the rail shooter of Rebel Assault. And this game actually got tons of really good reviews. It took place you played all the missions leading up to the destruction of the first Death Star, where you actually you can assume that you're Luke Skywalker at that point. But what happened was there was like a strategy guide came out for the game, and someone wrote like a little novella. It was like 96 to 100 pages or something like that. And you find out that your character is actually this person called Kian Farlander, which is kind of another one of those like iffy Star Wars names. But you come to find out, you're a rebel pilot, and these missions are going on behind the scenes of the movie. So it's not really mucking up the story. You're just like a rebel pilot. You're doing these like little missions, kind of like Rogue Squadron, where you were doing stuff like that. It basically the novella was kind of like, they put it in the strategy guide because he was describing vaguely what he did in the missions to win them. So it's kind of telling you how to beat the mission when you play it. That was the whole purpose of it. Right. So yeah, and like I said, I had the collector's edition CD-ROM at the time with the expansion packs. Yeah, so those were. Do you remember playing any of those games? I know you played Rebel Assault with me. I can't remember if you ever played.
It must have been about 20 years ago. I remember. I think it was like a Thanksgiving or something. I'd come over to your house, and Rebel Assault was fucking frustrating. I remember you were definitely a lot better at it than me. I remember the Hoth level in particular was extremely difficult for me. You were what? We were in a snow speeder trying to shoot the AT-AT walkers or something, right?
Yeah. Yep.
I remember that being a bitch, because it's a rail shooter format, so you couldn't really deviate much. I remember like struggling against the joystick to try to make it respond to what I wanted to do or whatever. I don't know. I ate snowy shit quite often in that game. So I definitely remember that. But I vaguely remember the X-Wing one that you mentioned, the protecting the ship so it could make the jump to hyperspace. I'm pretty sure I only played, those are probably the only 2 levels of each of those games I ever encountered. Because all I did was try them when I was over at your house. Yeah. But, at the time, they were mind-blowing, they were awesome. Like you said, it was a chance to really feel like you were kind of taking part in the movie in a way,
Yeah, definitely. Well, that was the whole appeal for me. I mean, like I said, that Rebel Assault game, if you look at even in those days standards of video games, it's pretty terrible. But you got to participate, and that was pretty cool. I mean, that was like, I don't know how many times as a kid I pretended like I was like Luke and I was running around the Death Star shooting stormtroopers and stuff like that, or like blowing up TIE fighters. That was a cool part of my fantasy land I lived in. So yeah, it was really neat to be a part of that. So
in my mind's eye, the graphics were awesome, but I probably would be very sad if I looked at it now.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the thing, because like it's always in hindsight. You're like, man, how could we think that was cool? I mean, it was like those games, like Resident Evil on PlayStation, like they were awesome. And now you look at it, you're like, it's not even close. But yeah, I do remember them being kind of innovative at the time. Well, the Rebel Assault game, it used not only like computer generated images, but it used like actors and real people kind of like superimposed on that too. So it kind of looked a little weird. But yeah, X-Wing, it was just basically you're in a cockpit and you're flying around, so there isn't really a lot of detail in that respect. But yeah, it was pretty cool. Definitely awesome. So.
Right.
All right. So what did you have for number two?
Well, like I said, I struggled quite a bit with coming up with things that were truly outside of the original trilogy. So my last two kind of loosely are part of the original trilogy, but sort of external products or whatever. Number two for me is the awesome early 80s breakfast cereal known as C3POs.
Fantastic.
Yeah, actually earlier tonight, me and my brother stumbled upon the commercial for it, and I've seen it a million times. It never gets old. It's actually really cool to think about, in terms of movies today. Like the commercial, it's not just something that cuts and pastes a bunch of clips from the movie that are already produced or whatever, and just kind of pastes them over an advertisement. They get the real. It's actually Anthony Daniels doing the voice of C3PO. They get the real costumes and props together and whatever, and they film a separate little piece for this cereal. And I'm I feel almost confident to assume that the budget for the commercial far exceeded the profit from sales of the cereal itself. But god damn it, was it worth it? Because it's awesome. Really, the cereal was. I think I only had it once or twice as a kid. It didn't blow me away. It was basically, if remember Alphabets, the cereal?
Yeah.
It's pretty much that, just like the commercial describes it as two O's kind of fused together for a double crunch, whatever that means.
Yeah.
But basically they were looked like little number eights made out of Cheerios that had like a sweet glaze on them. I don't know. I don't really know what that has to do with C3PO or anything. But again, at that time period, Star Wars was everywhere, and in the eyes of a lot of kids, could do no wrong, really. So I just, for the nostalgia of it, and just for the fact that it existed, I always loved it, and that is definitely my number two.
I like it. It's funny you mentioned Anthony Daniels doing C3PO because it's almost like every time C3PO is like licensed out to do like something, he does the voice of him, and which is I think is cool because it's almost like he owned that character. And he's
That's
like,
true.
you know what? If you're gonna use C3PO, I'm gonna do the voice, and that's like my stipulation, which is fine
It's
because I
awesome.
don't want. I mean, it's easily imitatable, but I just like it that he does that.
Yeah.
And I do remember the cereal. It's kind of funny. I didn't even think of food as something that would have been on my list. And I want to say too. I know that a lot of my interest in this things that I found were like video games, and I know that you've like you said you've liked video games, but I think I've definitely probably had a little more exposure to them than you have, or I took more of an interest into it, which is why I found things that
Yeah,
might not have hit your radar. So I want to point that out all too. But
for sure.
yeah, that's an interesting pick, and I like your reasons behind it. That's pretty neat. I do remember the C3PO cereal. It'd be great to get a box of that, not to eat it because that'd be ridiculous, but just to
To
have
have the
it. I'm
box,
sure
yeah.
Steven Sansweet does.
Oh, I'm
Mega Star
sure.
Wars collector that he is.
By the case.
Okay, my number two was actually it was a cartoon called The Clone Wars. Now it's not the one that we were talking about in the last one where it's like 3D rendering and whatnot.
Right.
This is actually an original. They called it a micro series. It was released in 2003 on the Cartoon Network. Basically, they call it a micro series because it was released in 2 to 3 minute episodes, known as micro episodes. I didn't actually see it when it was on the actual network. I got into it because when I worked, I lived in Virginia at the time. Worked at a Barnes and Noble. One of the guys I worked with in the music department, I was working with that day. I was shelving some stuff, and that DVD was one of the things I shelved. I'm like, what the heck is this? Have you seen this? He's like, oh yeah, that's great. You should totally get that and watch it. So I'm like, I had a employee discount, so I bought it for like $12. I took it home. I was actually surprised. It was released in 2 volumes on a DVD. Like I said, I previously mentioned the volume one was in the 2 to 3 minute episodes. Volume two was more. The episodes were longer. They were more like 15 minutes a piece. But I'll go through the basic rundown of the story. I'll tell you why I liked him. Volume one, the main story was it followed Obi-Wan Kenobi. He led a group of clones on the planet. It was called Munilinists or something like that. It's the actual homeworld of the Banking Clan, which is briefly mentioned in episode 2, Attack of the Clones, as one of the separatist organizations that's with them. And basically, Anakin, who's still his apprentice at the time, is appointed to lead the Space Forces by Palpatine. And now, while these things are going on, Dooku, the Sith Lord with Palpatine at the time, is training his new apprentice, Massage Ventress, who you mentioned before,
Right.
who is basically a Jedi who's turned bad. So he starts training her, and she actually figures prominently into the expanded Clone Wars universe. Like, she's in the actual 3D cartoon quite a bit. So she is a character that is an official character of the stories now, because it's in the newer Clone Wars cartoon. But anyway, this started it showed him training her and how he picked her from these people that were trying to like win his favor, apparently. So anyway, after this battle is done on Munilist, Anakin actually chases her to Yavin 4, which is where the Rebel base is in A New Hope, where he defeats her lightsaber duel. Now, you don't really know if she dies or not. He just beats her. Apparently, she doesn't die because she shows up all over the place.
Right.
But basically, to defeat her, he has to tap into like his dark side and not be a Jedi for a couple seconds when he beats her. Other episodes in this, they show Mace Windu defeat like an entire droid army on Dantooine. So it's like you get a glimpse of Dantooine. It shows Yoda in a very short episode, and then this other Jedi named Kit Fisto.
Yeah.
He's the one that it kind of looks like a lizard, and he's got those green dreadlock type things. He's actually, they fight some separatists on the homeworld of Admiral Akbar. And it's like an underwater fight, which is kind of weird, but again, it works. Yeah, Mon Calamari, right? It's a trap. So that was the volume 1. Volume 2 was the longer stories, and it actually shows Anakin getting initiated as a Jedi, which has never been shown or depicted anywhere before, and they did like a Jedi initiation ritual. But it prominently features a character I hate, unfortunately, but it works. Is General Grievous is in this prominently,
right.
and it basically shows him messing up some Jedi, and then it shows him kidnapping the senator, Chancellor Palpatine at the time, taking him to his ship, and then Obi-Wan and Anakin get called to go rescue him, and that leads right into Episode 3. So like this volume, like I just said, it shows that whole process of him somehow kidnapping him or whatever. What I didn't like is what I just said, General Grievous. I hate that character. We can go into that some other time. I'm just not a fan of that character. But
Agreed.
What I liked about these is they had a really gritty and like serious feel to them. I mean, they were cartoons, but a lot of what I hate about all this other Star Wars stuff is that it's very kid friendly, which is fine, but it kind of, I think it lacks on the story a little bit when you get into this whole kid thing. But it had a really gritty, serious feel to it, and it was satisfying in that respect. It actually kind of fills in some gaps because, like, in episode 1, or I'm sorry, 4, the first movie, Obi-Wan's telling Luke, like, oh, he was the best star pilot I've ever seen. He was a cunning warrior. You don't really see any of this stuff in the movies. This one kind of, in some of these little clips they show, he's saving people from certain doom, and he's showing off his skills. He's showing that he's a really good pilot. It fills in those gaps because, like, I end up hating the character of Anakin Skywalker, basically, from like these holes in the story and the actor who portrayed him. I don't like, not saying anything about Hayden Christensen as a person, but lacking seriously on the acting ability in these movies.
For sure.
So it gave him a more authentic feel of what you'd want to see Anakin Skywalker as, this powerful, person who just takes the fall, Yeah, so that was really what I liked about them. They showed a lot of that stuff like they'd never done before, like I said, with the initiation ritual. And there's really more of an emotional involvement with the characters in this thing because they're not like robotic. There's some kind of there's layers to them. It shows how Obi-Wan Kenobi is called General. Because that's what Leia calls him in A New Hope. So it kind of sets him on the path of he's like the people's soldier kind of thing. He wears the Stormtrooper armor. To be more like the clones that he's leading. And it kind of shows how he starts to develop the relationship with them and why eventually when they turn on him it hurts him because if you look at episode 3 you gotta kind of feel bad for Obi-Wan Kenobi. Holy crap, like he's got to kill his best friend, like all these clones that he trusts turn on him, like Padme dies in childbirth. That guy is like messed up. You know what I mean?
No wonder he goes into hiding for 30 years.
yeah, he becomes a hermit because he can't take his shitty life at that point. But have you seen any of these
No,
at all?
I haven't actually seen them. I vaguely remember. I remember being annoyed when the computer animated Clone Wars was announced as the Clone Wars because the earlier one had the same title or whatever. I just thought it was silly and confusing and whatever. This is the one. Correct me if I'm wrong. You're talking about the one that's almost slightly Japanese looking or very thick black lines, sort of.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, very almost like paper cutout looking or something. Yeah, I remember
Yeah.
being impressed with the style, like the quality of it, but I never really. I think at the time too, I was just so annoyed with and burnt out on anything that had to do with the prequels or the continuity that they established. So by that point, I was way off the train. So yet another thing that I'll probably have to go back and take a look at. And now that a decade or more has passed, I can judge it on its own merits.
Yeah, I'll let you borrow it. But yeah, it kind of goes back to what you said. I think the style of it was pretty cool too. You know, it kind of had that. It was a different, and it was like traditional animation to me. It wasn't computers and let's just push a couple buttons. I mean, it looked like it was drawn,
Yeah,
and someone had to put some effort into it. So that kind of, I think, was a bit of an appeal for it too. So yeah,
gotcha.
I'll let you take a look at that. I liked them a lot when they came out. I mean, it was something that, like, as a fan, I pined for something that was good about these prequels because, like, like you said, like they were such a disappointment for us, being lifelong fans of something and being really let down. And it was kind of weird because I just happened to come across it because I was working in a bookstore, that sells DVDs too, and was recommended. So yeah, I kind of came across it in a chance way. I do remember fondly like watching, like, yeah, that was awesome. Like, I'm so glad I watched that.
Yeah, that's cool.
Okay, drum roll. What is your number one
Well,
thing?
honestly, my number one, it has been, and even up to this moment, sort of as a tie for me between what I want to say my number one is versus what I want my one and only honorable mention to be, because they're both kind of super impactful in the Star Wars world for different reasons. So I guess I'm going to pick. I'm going to pick the 2006 DVDs as my number one. Now, it sort of breaks the rule because it's the original trilogy themselves that I'm including as number one. What these are was two disc DVDs that released the up to that point the accepted editions of the movies, and the reason I put it as number one is because to this day it is the only form of being able to buy those movies on digital format, on digital media, outside of Laserdisc, which is
What's that?
honestly almost doesn't even count because as cool as that is, I mean, you're not, does anybody have a Laserdisc player? And uh,
Not
you know, they also haven't really held up super well in terms of durability, and they're not really viable. So, but ironically, these DVDs pretty much just wholesale the took scans of those laser discs and put them on DVD as is. And yeah, it's ironic because I'm picking the movies themselves to be something outside of the original trilogy, but to me, because they're involved in, or the only way to get them is to buy versions of the original trilogy that are not the original trilogy, if this makes any
Right.
sense. So it sort of still fits for me. Hopefully, but realistically not. But hopefully, Disney's, because they actually own the rights only to two out of the three films now. But everybody's hoping that they will rectify this and make new versions available of the original movies. But it's a long shot because Disney has Lucasfilm, but the rights don't transfer until 2020, and even then, it's only the rights to Empire Strikes Back, Return of the Jedi, and the three prequel movies. 20th Century Fox contractually will retain control legally of Episode 4, A New Hope, basically as long as they want. Unless Disney can put together a really sweet offer and make them sell them. But,
Mhm.
that's highly unlikely. 20th Century Fox is said to be extremely upset with George Lucas for not being given the opportunity to purchase the other films before he just sold everything to Disney. So perhaps just out of spite, they're going to hold on to it.
They probably will, because that's how people act in that industry too. It's
Yeah,
all spiteful and childish behavior.
Of course. And in the
That's
end,
good.
it's the fans who pay the price.
Yeah, which wouldn't even be as popular if we didn't have fans. So kind of a weird circle here.
It is.
That's a good pick, and I remember you're right. I wouldn't have put that on there because you did kind of.
I broke the rule, but
you did break the rule. That's fine. We're not jerks here.
But wait till my honorable mention. I might redeem myself.
Okay. Well, it's funny because I remember hearing about though when they came out, they're like, yeah, we're going to release the DVD with the theatrical version. I basically wet my pants.
Yeah, of course.
Because I was so excited about that. So that once again kind of injected the Star Wars fever back into me that was kind of waning at that point. I mean, 2006, like what was going on? Like Revenge of the Sith came out the year before that, and I was just like,
it's over. Yep.
Yeah, it's done with. So yeah, that's pretty cool. All right, my number one, once again, is a video game. Now, the video game that I picked is called Knights of the Old Republic, and I played it on the original Xbox. This was released in 2003. It was developed by a company called BioWare. The head writer of this game, his name is Drew Karpyshyn. He actually wrote some novels kind of involving this time period later on that I like too, which I probably should have put in the honorable mention. But anyway, a little background. This is a role-playing game, and it has turn-based combat, they call it, where basically you push the attack button, you roll some invisible dice. If your attack's higher than your opponent's defense, like whatever, it's back and forth like that. Role-playing games were never something I liked at all until I played this game, and I think because it was a Star Wars game. But basically, your character, you become a Jedi, and as you level up, you get to pick more powers, more abilities, things like that. That's just the basics of a role-playing game. All right, I'll go through the story of this, and the story I think is what made it awesome. And the other thing that made it awesome was, I'll get to that in a minute. Anyway, the story takes place roughly like 4,000 years before the events of A New Hope. So already we're in a situation, story continuity-wise, where really nothing can mess up the continuity or leave a hole for something, because you're talking about a time period that's thousands of years before what we're used to seeing. Okay, so it's basically like uncharted territory. I mean, Dark Horse Comics were putting out Star Wars comics at the time, before that as well, and they kind of started going into like old Jedi, the origins of the Jedi and stuff like that. But nothing really was interesting to me, and there's so many comics you couldn't keep up with it. But so basically, it takes place, like I said, 4,000 years before. The galaxy's under attack by a Sith called Darth Malak, and he's basically a fallen Jedi who commands a Sith armada of seemingly unlimited resources. And many of the Jedi of the time have either died or they have joined forces with him. Now, your character in your story pickup, your ship's under attack by this fleet of his, and they're after basically a Jedi that's a passenger on your ship. Her name's Bastila, and you come to find out that she's really the key to the Republic's war effort to beat the Sith. And you eventually have to rescue her from a planet that you crash land on, and you make your way to the Jedi Enclave that's on the planet Dantooine. So this is like you get to see this, fictional Dantooine that they mentioned for like 2 sentences in the original movie, but turns out there's a Jedi base there, which you can kind of fast forward a little bit and say, well, maybe that's the base that the rebels were on, when they abandoned it, and when Leia told Tarkin that, that's where their base was. But so you go there and you discover that your character is force sensitive, and you actually train to be a Jedi. Now, the goal of the game is that you become a Jedi and you have to defeat this Darth Malak. Now, getting into this a little bit in depth, it was neat because you got to choose whether or not you were a good guy or a bad guy. So when you're interacting with characters and things and actions that are happening in the game, the choices you make decide whether or not you become more to the light side or more to the dark side. And so throughout the game, the choices you make are going to control this or whatnot. And basically, to defeat this guy, you have to go to 4 other planets and find these things called star maps, and they're going to give you coordinates to this unknown place where they think the power of the Sith fleet is coming from. Okay, now spoiler alert. They kind of talk about it throughout the game. Darth Malak was actually the apprentice of Darth Revan, who was another fallen Jedi. And throughout the story, they say that Revan's dead. But really what happened was when they attacked Revan's ship, Malak turned on him, because that's kind of like what the Sith do. When you have the opportunity to take the mantle of the master, you kill the master, and the apprentice becomes the master. But it turns out Revan didn't die. The Jedi basically take you, erase your memory and brainwash you, and then they kind of make you like a good or a bad guy. But they're basically using you against him to see if you can retrace the steps of how they got so powerful. So you either become a good Jedi, you defeat Malak and you save the universe, or you become a Sith, you defeat Malak and you take control of the fleet, and then you continue the war, kind of thing. So that's basically getting into it. What I liked about it was you got to make the choices that I was talking about, to be either light or dark. And I think this kind of goes back to what I was saying about those other video games, was that you got to be a part of the universe. But in this case, you got to be like the ultimate part of the universe. You got to play, your character was a Jedi, and you had to make the decisions that basically end up determining the fate of this universe that you're playing in. It was a very engrossing and original story. They kind of used a lot of elements of those Dark Horse comics that I was talking about that they did at the time, but it further explored the lore and like the history of the Sith and the Jedi and the conflict and how they became about. It also further explains the Mandalorians, who Boba Fett wears their armor. The character of Jango Fett in the prequel trilogy is a Mandalorian, so that's basically where it comes from. But it further explores the lore of them, because the reason why these Jedi left and came back as Sith was because they defied the orders of the Council and went with the Republic to attack the Mandalorian armada or whatever that was wreaking havoc on the Outer Rim, and they came back as conquerors, and they're like, well, how'd that happen? And that's basically the basis of the story. So there was a lot of things that fit together well. I mean, just being the fact that you could actually be a Jedi in your character, you got to choose the color of your lightsaber, what force powers you had, you got to be like the class of Jedi, like you could be like a Jedi Guardian who was more combat based, or like a Jedi Counselor who used wisdom and powers more.
Right.
It was just an overall really good experience, and I can't really think of anything I didn't like about it, to be honest with you. I mean, the voice acting was superb. The characters and allies you meet across the game are, I mean, they're similar to a lot of the characters that are already made, but they're different enough, and they're deep. They have layers to them. There's like subtle nuances that set them apart from the characters, of the original trilogy and stuff like that. So it was really just an overall awesome game. I'm not sure, you probably haven't played it, or if you have you heard anything about it, or anything you can add? That was a long ramble I just gave about that game. But
well, if there's anybody listening to this who now still has a question or does not understand anything about this game, then there's no hope for you.
Yeah, exactly.
I was always aware of it. Very interested in it based on all of my experiences with it until actual gameplay. I think I played it once or twice, and I just couldn't get into it because of the gameplay. Because, and actually, you bringing this up reminded me of something else, and inspires me to add a second honorable mention at the last minute here. But yeah, all my years of childhood and everything, I always yearned for, a way to inhabit that role of, being a Jedi or whatever. But this is just not the way I hoped for it to play out. It's more of it's more of a mental stimulus than a recreation of the actual feeling of being the character, for me anyway. I was aware of it. I appreciated all the effort that went into it, and it's sort of, in my eyes, it was kind of a continuation of the idea and expansion on the foundation that was established with Shadows of the Empire, which is, the multimedia aspect of it. I mean, at that point, pretty much any Star Wars property was going to be a multimedia thing. But to tie the comics into the video game, and put it out as, I'm pretty sure there were at least statues or something else licensed from it as well. I don't know that it was as comprehensive as Shadows of the Empire, but, basically it's along that same. So I appreciated it, but I was never super into it. So yeah, it's not even on my list. But I mean, it obviously was a huge success, and it was really, really impactful culturally, because I remember, all the video game magazines at the time were obsessed with it, and it definitely sold a ton of copies. But yeah, I don't really have a lot of experience with it.
Yeah, I think with the gameplay aspect of it, it did take me a while to get past that, because that was never a type of game I liked. I still don't really play that many role playing games. I'm more of like first person shooter action kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it was different for me, and I think me it was like perseverance was the key. I had to stick with it and keep going, and I think that's what to me was a personal accomplishment, that I got over a hurdle of something I didn't want to do, so I attached that to it as well.
Right.
But yeah, I think a lot of it,
it's a good point.
really Yeah, what came down to it for me was that it was the story was so good, and I really had not seen anything like it. And I know that he took a lot of elements of stuff that had already been done before, but they weren't major plot points. Like they would just mention like an old Jedi that was in like this Dark Horse comic about the early Jedi, like Tales of the Jedi or something that it was called. And it really, it launched actually another. I'm sure you've heard of the massive multiplayer online games
Yeah.
like Warcraft, stuff like that. There's one for Star Wars called the Old Republic, and it takes place. And I know the character of Revan, who, like I said, you eventually are. It comes to find out you are, plays a part in that too. There was a sequel to this game too called The Sith Lords. It took place 5 years after this game, but it was very because like it's kind of hard to do that because like you either play as a character as a good guy, you save the universe, or you destroy it as a Sith.
Right.
So it's kind of hard to tie that into what if you chose the latter. But I think really to me it was just the story was so good and it was really engrossing. And the guy that wrote it, written a few novels involving like the early lore of the Sith, and like he wrote a couple novels about Darth Bane, who is the one that came up with the rule of two. There's only two Sith, Master and Apprentice, because in this time period there were so many Sith they'd start fighting with each other, and it was really counterproductive for them. And I know the character of Darth Bane shows up in the new Clone Wars 3D cartoon in the Lost episodes. So that's kind of neat that they chose that, and that's a part of the that's a part of the official story now, canon. And an interesting point about Revan, the way Revan is depicted in the video game is very similar to a lot of the concept art I've seen from episode 7. So I'm kind of wondering if they're taking this character of this ancient Sith and kind of putting it in there somehow, which would actually kind of explain a lot of things that I think a lot of people missed about the trailer as well, but we can talk about that some other time. So maybe possible episode 7 tie-in of this Darth Revan character. All right, so that was my number one thing. What were some of your honorable mentions that you had?
Well, my number one was sort of, I still debate whether I should have picked this or not. I guess more of a true number one is my first honorable mention. I don't know. I guess it didn't seem right because it's not. It exists in Star Wars Purgatory, and that would have to be the infamous 1978 Star Wars Holiday Special.
I knew it. I knew it.
You had to know. I mean, if just in fitting with my sense of humor, I guess that deserved to be the rightful number one. As much as it doesn't officially exist, I think it's really important in some ways in terms of the bigger Star Wars picture because of the fact that, and maybe inspired by this, George Lucas is notoriously controlling with all aspects of the Star Wars property. At least he was until he sold everything to Disney. In some ways, though, I mean, he still is very heavily involved. I read something that he still retains. I don't know if it's final approval, but he still has to be notified when decisions are made, basically. But yeah, I mean, this is a guy who, went back and when the special editions were released, altered pretty much the bulk of the existing usable original negatives to make copies of the film from, to the point where, he wanted to ensure that his new, in his mind, more perfect version of his creation would be the only thing that people would be able to purchase legally. And that's an extension of what happened with this holiday special. The fact that it's classified more as musical comedy and secondarily adventure kind of says something. You also have to remember that this was an era where there was a lot of cocaine use happening in the entertainment industry kind of freely. So there's a famous inside joke that the Star Wars Holiday Special was basically born out of a big bag of cocaine. And if you watch it, it kind of watches in that way. But just for what it represents something that George Lucas has been quoted as saying that if he had time and a sledgehammer, he would track down every single copy and destroy it forever. And the fact that somebody recorded it in 1978 and preserved it and copied it and perpetuated it in an totally underground way outside of his reach, and the fact that it is available on YouTube to this day, I don't know, I think it's sort of a symbolic thing. It's sort of an underdog victory in a way for all the fans to kind of like, it'll always be our fuck you for, destroying the original versions of those movies. And maybe this takes being a fan of something a little too seriously. I don't disagree with that either, but it's just kind of nice to have something like this that represents those ideals. And let's be honest, I mean, to a point, it is pretty fun to see. Just as a time capsule, it's got all of the actors, the principal actors from the cast of the first three movies of the original trilogy. It's goofy because it's basically this plot where Han Solo is trying to get Chewbacca to his home planet of Kashyyyk to be reunited with the rest of his family, his wife and his father and his kid for their version of Christmas called Life Day or whatever. It kind of shows the misadventures that they have in between, and shows like the Muppet Show, the Carol Burnett Show were popular at the time, and they're just kind of a cross between sketch comedy and musical shows, and that's pretty much the format that this took. And sure, it's not necessarily what you think of when you think of Star Wars, but again, it's just a really, really interesting, if bizarre, slice of pop culture from that time, and I think it's important that it continues to exist regardless of how bizarre it is and how much George Lucas would prefer otherwise. And I know I brought it up in one of our earlier episodes, and I might have made the same point, but again, there's a lot of really odd stuff in here, but it can be argued, I think, rather successfully that a lot of things in the prequels are far more cringy than some of the moments in this. And let's be honest, this is also the first appearance of the Boba Fett character that became basically the most popular character in Star Wars ever. There's a little animated segment with Han and Luke, and I haven't seen it in a long time, so I don't recall it, but I know they go on some planet, and Boba Fett shows up to save them, riding on some big dinosaur-looking thing. So it's a little rough, and it's very early, and his color scheme was all different, but yeah, I mean it'll always be associated with that character for that reason. So that is my first honorable mention, and probably should have been my number one.
No, I agree with that, especially with the discussion of it being symbolic of something. There's definitely symbolism to it to us now. I mean, obviously not when it came out, because no one could predict the future and say, well, 20 years from now we're going to hold this dear because you suck. It
sure.
was obviously that didn't happen. So I think now you're right. And I'm glad you brought up that point about Boba Fett, because if anything, you can take out of that was good, it was the introduction of one of the most popular characters in the whole universe. So I remember watching it that first time, and it was cool because I felt like I was watching something new, because I'd never seen it before.
Yeah.
I never even heard of it until you mentioned it. And yeah, my short opinion to that was that, yeah, it was pretty terrible.
Yeah.
But you're right. I mean, you could argue that a lot of the stuff that was in the prequel trilogy, I mean, was it really any worse than that? Like, you could make that argument. But yeah, I do agree with that. The symbolism of it is great. Coming from someone who, like you said, George Lucas is so controlling, and kind of having that over him, so to speak.
Yeah.
Nowadays is pretty good.
For sure.
What do I have for honorable mention? I'll just go through mine real quick because I don't really need to talk about them a lot. I had a couple other video games on there that were good. There was a series called Battlefront. I'm not sure if you heard of that. It was basically, it was just like a third-person shooter where you'd go around shooting stormtroopers and stuff. Battlefront series is good. There was also a first-person shooter called Dark Forces that came out, and its sequels. That was really the first time that you actually a first-person shooter game where you got to shoot stormtroopers, so that was cool. Now, one video game I know you remember was the 1983 Star Wars Atari arcade game with the old vector graphics.
Right.
It had, I know that the movie theater in Portland had it in its lobby. That was another one thing that was pretty cool. And the other honorable mentions I have are basically just those cartoons that we were talking about, the Clone Wars and the new Rebels cartoon. Like I said, I haven't really got into the Clone Wars yet, but I've heard a lot of positive things about it. Like you said before, it was probably one of the best managed things outside of the, original trilogy and expanded universe. And I've been getting into this Rebels cartoon. Funny or a cool story about that. The new episode that aired on Monday had Billy D. Williams reprising his role as Lando Calrissian, who was a character on the episode. So that was pretty cool. So
Definitely.
actually, those are all my honorable mentions. So far the Rebel show I'm still into. Like I said, there are more adult elements to it. There is the kiddie element to it as well, but it's kind of mix and match. So far I haven't lost interest in it yet. So, what was your last honorable mention?
I'm actually really pissed at myself for forgetting that arcade game now that you mention it, because that thing is so awesome. To this day, it's awesome. Uh, my other one that you reminded me of was the video game, the Xbox video game Obi-Wan, which
Yes.
you gave to me. I first played, I think, because of you. And it's as a whole, it wasn't a game that really like I don't know shook things up or revolutionized anything. But for me, it was my first experience, and to this day, most satisfying experience with being able to play the kind of Star Wars video game I always wanted, where you could actually you would take on the role of Obi-Wan, and you had you could roam freely, you had immediate control over his actions, you got to do all the awesome lightsaber stuff that you always wished you could do after watching those movies. And it gave you some new stuff that uh, you didn't really see until the prequels came out, when they sort of expanded and on the fighting styles and made Jedi abilities a little more fancy. Um, but I just remember, you could do all the acrobatics. You could have a force assisted leap. You could use the force to throw enemies away from you or to suck objects into your hand, just like Darth Vader does in Empire Strikes Back when Han Solo starts shooting at him. All those awesome things. You could whip your lightsaber out like a boomerang, so it would just spin around and destroy everything in its path. I mean, to me, that was the stuff I always wanted to sink my teeth into. And the graphics at the time were cool. They haven't really aged very well, but I really, really enjoyed the that those aspects of the game that gave you those abilities. It was kind of a standard game otherwise, but yeah, that is my only other honorable mention.
Yeah, I do remember that, and that's kind of the opposite of that role playing game aspect that I was talking about. You're right. You actually got to instead of pushing a button and then your character went and did something, you actually controlled the action. And I remember like the way you moved your joysticks around was how you would do a different like lightsaber swipe or like a move or something
Yeah,
like that. Like there's a little more complicated than just like pressing a button and running around talking to people. There was it was an action based Jedi game, and yeah, I liked it for that reason exactly what you said. And yeah, I remember I actually do remember giving that game to you because I had it. I think I was on leave from the Navy or something like that. I just brought my Xbox home and I came over to your house and we were playing it or something. But yeah, that was a pretty good game.
yep.
So I guess that concludes our list of things we like about Star Wars that are not the original trilogy. Interesting topic. Yeah, we could probably talk at length about this for days. So I think we'll wrap it up right here. That sounds good to me.
Probably
So.
feels like we already have.
Yeah, and if you're listening and you're still with us, we thank you and we appreciate your patience and understanding and interest in what we're talking about. Yeah, if you didn't, whatever.
Well, I mean, I like to think that there's always a little something for everybody.
Well, we definitely went more towards the entertainment, sports-based talk than like the current events talk. So
Well, I mean,
we'll get back into more mixed match next time. But
for sure. I mean, I believe this is perhaps the debut of any kind of sports talk on our podcast here. So,
yeah,
you know,
definitely. I wouldn't mind talking about some hockey stuff. Like our Rangers are playing pretty awesome right now, so
yeah.
be
Unfortunately,
hopeful for that.
I've
Yeah.
been out of the loop on that. I almost feel like it's probably better for them if I stay out of the loop. And,
Superstition.
yeah, you can't. Regardless of how logical you are outside of the world of sports, the minute you become invested in a sports team, you cannot help but become at least somewhat superstitious, on some level. And I have no rational explanation for it. I'm as guilty of it as anybody, though. I mean, it is. I mean, maybe it's fun too to be superstitious as a sports fan, but
I think so.
it's definitely something that it's almost involuntary. It's like, oh man, of course, second I start watching it and get involved, like they start losing again or whatever. I mean, who doesn't enjoy going to a Mets game and turning their hat inside out, Howard Jones or Johnson style, uh, to hope in hopes that they're gonna rally. I mean,
Yep.
I don't know. It's a tradition in a way.
Indeed. And remember, it's only crazy if it doesn't work. So when it works, it's perfectly sane. But well, I mean, I remember when the Giants won their first Super Bowl against the Patriots. I believe that was man, I can't remember the year. I'm so old now. It was like 07 or 08. Anyway, I remember watching the playoffs in the championship series, I ended up wearing a pair of like track pants or something, and I got so excited when they won one of their games that like I jumped up in the air, and when I landed, I didn't realize it, but I had stepped on my pant leg, and when I went to walk, it like ripped it. So I was like, oh man, I ripped these pants. And then it turned out the next game was the NFC Championship game, and I put those pants on, forgetting about the rip. Okay, so they won again. I was like, yeah, they won. And I went crazy. I was like, hey, I'm wearing those ripped pants. So those turned into my playoff Giants lucky ripped pants.
Right.
And I wore them for the Super Bowl. And guess what? They won the Super Bowl.
Right.
So fast forward a couple years, they go to the Super Bowl again with the Patriots. And what I do, whip those pants out. And I had to work. I worked some overtime that Sunday at work. So I kind of had to like, clip my pants together because they would have been really cold when I was walking around outside. I remember I went home, watched the game in those pants, won the Super Bowl again. So there you go. Every time they go to the Super Bowl, I got to wear the lucky pants and they win. But that's no basis in reality.
None whatsoever.
Like, no way. But hey, whatever.
And yet you are validated every time.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's the thing too. You think about all the other people that are superstitious and doing their weird superstitious things. So maybe our powers of superstition just beat the other team's powers of superstition. I don't know. That'd be an interesting thing to explore, I think. But
cultural mental battle.
Yeah.
That one you were talking, was that the year of the David Tyree catch against his head? Is that the one you were talking about?
Yeah, that was the first time they beat the Patriots. He caught it right on his head, and yeah.
I actually, I'm not really a huge football guy. Growing up, my dad was a Giants fan, so I guess if there's a gun to my head, I would root for the Giants. So, but that year, I was actually rooting against them very, very heavily because.
Well, yeah, you were in the sweatshop at that point, right?
Yeah, that story I always tell about. I was a screen printer at that point, and we had an account with Reebok to print off championship shirts if the Giants won, and basically they had to be printed overnight and shipped out the next day, to be available immediately if they won. And as soon as that happened, I just turned the TV off and started walking to work because I knew. And I get there, and sure enough, and instantly for the next, I think it was like 13 hours straight, it was just nonstop T-shirt printing. World champion New York Giants. I had the task of having to put those official hologram stickers on each one, right off the assembly line. And yeah, my arms were destroyed by the end of that.
Man.
But looking back on it, I guess it's kind of funny. It's certainly an interesting story. But yeah.
Well, I thank you for printing in the shirt that I bought. That
yeah, sure, no problem. I really didn't want him to win.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because the second time they won, I was watching it with my friend Mark, and as soon as the game was over, for whatever reason, Dick's Sporting Goods opened up for like 2 hours and started selling the merchandise. So as soon as they won that game, man, we got in our car, drove over to Dick's, waited in line, got in, bought our championship gear like that night. Like, that's ridiculous. And it's like, you got to make that stuff ahead of time.
Right.
Which is ridiculous, stupid. So I can just imagine all the Patriots stuff that was back there. They didn't break out.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, we send that stuff to third world countries too. Like, thanks a lot for your scraps.
Yeah. all of the screen printers in Boston got to sleep in that night.
Yeah, those lucky dogs. Well, they probably didn't work in. Well, maybe they did work in sweatshops like you did. We'll leave that company's name out of it. I don't want a lawsuit. So. All right, so I think that's a good ending point for episode 5 here. A couple things I want to talk about next time. First thing is it's Star Wars related. I know we've talked our heads off about that one tonight. Next time, though, there is a series of comic books that are being released by Marvel Comics now that, as you know, are owned. The parent company is Disney, so they're putting out comics that are supposedly be like official story, and they're going to tie in with the new movie. They released the first one. Titled aptly Star Wars. I'm holding it up so you can see it, but no one else can. It was released on January 14th. I'm going to go through a little review of that and give you my thoughts on that. There are going to be 2 other titles released February and March, respectively. One about Darth Vader, one about Princess Leia. So I'll be looking into those. I'm kind of actually interested in it. So I'm going to be back in my comic book days over the next year or so at least. So yeah, there was that. Actually, I said a few things, but that's the other thing escapes my mind right now, so we'll figure it out. But anything else you want to have everybody be on the lookout for?
I think next time I'd like to touch on some of the advertising tactics that are engaged in by massive corporations that basically play on the emotions of the consumer, or in this case, the patriotism of the consumer. Maybe discuss the ethics of that and whatnot. Also, I'd like to discuss and touch on there's a foreclosure epidemic happening, and it recently hit very close to home indeed. So I guess I'd just like to vent about that and maybe go over some of the finer points of what causes these things to happen.
Sounds good to me. All right. Yeah, literally and figuratively close to home on that one.
Yeah.
Cheapers. Okay, sounds good. So we'll have a little bit of both next time. So yeah, we thank you for listening and sticking with us the whole time. Tune in for our next episode, and we hope to see you there, but we don't really see anybody, do we? So
not yet anyway.
Not yet. Yeah. We'll be there someday. We'll have video podcasting. That's the ultimate goal right there.
Right.
Boom.
All right, well, this has been episode 5 of WAMCast. I'm your friend Claude.
And it's cousin Adam.
And we will see you next time. Bye.
Bye-bye.